Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute privilege to be up here. I want to thank Jo personally for her support and the CRDN for the invitation to speak today. So over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to provide some context around haemophilia care from both a personal and community perspective. I'm then, for the most part, going to draw on the evidence base and give my own interpretation as to why I strongly feel we need to advocate for and with young people living with haemophilia to safeguard their own futures. And finally, I'll set out what I think the next steps could be towards implementing a peer-led, empowerment-based approach to self-care education for this cohort in the UK. And just advance warning, I do have one glisser slide. I engage with industry in a non-clinical capacity through the consultancy, so in the spirit of transparency, these are my disclosures. So if I may, I'm going to kick off briefly with some scene setting, and for your reference, haemophilia is largely inherited, with around 70% of diagnosed individuals having a positive family history. And on screen is a beautiful photo of my granddad David, who lived with a severe form of haemophilia, and my grandmother Rose. Having discovered his first ever love letter to my nan, dated 1949, so they would have been aged 23 and 19 respectively, it's really touching to read about Grandad recovering from an ankle joint bleed. You can't really read it, but we've sort of highlighted it there. With his only option to literally wait and see if it improved. Now, ankle bleeds are a typical manifestation of haemophilia, and they're one of the most frequent sites of bleeding. And this was at a time where there were really no viable treatment options. So the romance veritably hinged on Grandad not only being physically able to see her, but also my grandmother's acceptance of his circumstances and ultimately falling in love with someone whose generation had a very uncertain future. 70 years on, the appetite to dramatically change the outlook of haemophilia care has heralded in a new horizon of treatment innovation and advances in clinical practice. The conundrum is, however, that this in itself creates complex scientific choices that are being and will need to be made, changing the dynamics of healthcare decision-making for both clinician and patient. How do we raise expectations of what's possible living with haemophilia and enable individuals the ability to make appropriate and informed treatment choices and weigh up risk against benefit for optimal care that's right for them? So for those who don't know, some really quick fire facts. Haemophilia is caused by a change on either the factor 8 or 9 gene on the X chromosome, meaning mainly boys are affected. The bleeding tendency generally correlates with the degree of factor deficiency, with the severe type below 1% prone to frequent episodes of spontaneous bleeding. Still, nearly a quarter of those living with moderate haemophilia, so levels between 1 to 5%, can also experience a more severe bleeding pattern. So in my family, for instance, myself, my baseline factor level is 2%, but I live with a severe bleeding phenotype. So I bleed like someone with levels below 1%. Our community has a connection to the monarchy, with haemophilia having figured prominently in European royalty in the 19th and 20th centuries. Queen Victoria's youngest son, Prince Leopold, was the first diagnosed in the family line. Clotting factors are key components of the coagulation cascade. So as such, the absence or deficiency in function ultimately prevents the fibrin reinforcement of the platelet plug at the site of injury, allowing more bleeding to occur. And also, 80 to 90% of bleeds occur in the musculoskeletal system, and recurrent joint bleeding can lead to chronic joint disease. And this resonates personally, as per my MRI on screen, having gone for a surgical ankle fusion, myself only age 16. So with that being said, what does a bleed look and feel like? So to the left of the screen, this was taken at the height of a joint bleed in my left ankle, and to the right, this was 8 days post a muscle bleed in my bicep. Now, these aren't a badge of honour. On the contrary, for me, it's a personal reminder of how bad it can get. And early signs of internal bleeding are associated with stiffness, discomfort, a weird sort of tingling feeling, and in joints it can actually be quite difficult to distinguish from arthritic pain. Together with the physical debilitation and psychological trauma of a bleed, it completely disrupts every aspect of daily life. My own clinical profile is one of escalating care needs as a consequence of a legacy of suboptimal treatment and what I reflect on as a naivety to the long-term outcomes of repetitive bleeds, most significantly during the key transitional phases of my growth, development and maturity. And I think certainly it's my drive and motivation to ensure other young people don't end up going down the same path, or at least have the same hairstyle. And hindsight is a beautiful thing. Yeah, it's awful. There we go. So the current standard of care is regular treatment with intravenous injection of replacement factor concentrate with the aim to convert severe into moderate phenotype to prevent bleeding and joint destruction. So for haemophilia A, my type, this recommendation as adopted by the UK is supported by the idea that increased time with a factor VIII activity level below 1% is associated with an increased rate of breakthrough bleeding. Now, due to the half-life of current standard products, prophylaxis is usually given every 2 to 3 times per week to maintain a trough level above that 1%, giving this sort of sawtooth effect. And although prophylaxis effectively reduces the frequency of bleeding events, many now advocate that complete bleed avoidance requires a higher trough level, tailored to the individual and their lifestyle needs. So, for example, someone who's physically active may require recurrent high peak levels to spend more time in the reduced bleeding risk zone, which I would point out, at the kind of the top under the curve. So at this point, we're going to quickly turn to Glyssa, and hopefully we can switch. So I would like to challenge your expectations of what you would consider an acceptable breakthrough bleed rate for someone like me living with a severe form of haemophilia on regular prophylactic treatment in the UK in any given year. And this is irrespective of what type of replacement clotting factor products are being used. So we've got 0, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, or more than 10 bleeds a year. Ooh. Welcome, Baroness Blackwood. Hi. Okay. Just consideration time. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so I'm not sure what I was expecting, actually, but I think certainly for the 44% that voted 0, you're not alone. And I'm going to try and refrain from any bias here, but you're certainly not alone. Okay, we're going to switch back. Fantastic. The growing consensus with supporting robust evidence suggests that children and adults can achieve an annualized bleed rate, an ABR, of 0 with standard prophylaxis, albeit influenced by a number of aspects that are patient and treatment related. So on this slide, this is a standalone retrospective study that considered treatment use and outcomes in all ages of moderate and severe haemophilia A and B over a 12-month period in 7 EU countries where developed healthcare systems exist, including the UK. So for the purposes of today, I've just extrapolated a part of the UK data only to paint some of the picture around bleed burden, but I would obviously encourage you to read the paper in its entirety. Now, significantly, in both cohorts, so this is the top stats. Significantly in both cohorts, over 3/4 self-reported more than 1 bleed, with moderate A and Bs coming out above that of severe, potentially reflecting the wide variability in consumption of factor and dose intervals, i.e. how often we're treating. And the median annualized bleed rate was as high as 4 for both severe types and moderate A, and 6 for moderate B, and notably across all countries for bleeds in all locations, so joints, muscles, etc. The UK had 3 of the 4 highest mean standard deviation, inferring that, relative to the other EU countries, the EU is getting inconsistent results from treatment strategies. Furthermore, we only have to look at the graph of total joint bleeds per patient. And I actually think this is quite powerful, to observe some self-reporting more than 10 bleeds, and if I had the laser, with a higher density, I believe, in adolescence and early adulthood. And the authors suggest this likely reflects insufficient therapy, presence of target joints, poor adherence, or as noted earlier, difficulty in correctly assessing bleeds from, say, arthritic pain, leading to over-reporting, which is a challenge in itself. In conclusion, the authors share the sentiment that appropriate prophylaxis should provide full protection against bleeds. Now, no one's saying that prophylaxis is easy, and nor is the broader, profound impact of living with or caring for someone with a rare and chronic condition like haemophilia. Starting from diagnosis at birth or shortly thereafter, and the additional stresses on the caregivers, right through to older age and associated comorbidities, haemophilia can demand huge lifestyle adjustments to avoid risk, as well as everyday disruption, in addition to the fear and uncertainty related with trauma-related bleeding. But it's these formative years of which I can relate to that are such a critical stage in the adoption of health-relevant behaviours, where habits, values and lifestyles established are likely to continue through our adulthood. And the often precarious journey from early adolescence to early adulthood, aged 10 to 24, is a particularly complex and turbulent phase with many practical, emotional and psychosocial barriers to overcome. Moreover, young people must learn to adapt themselves to the needs of their condition and accept increasing and eventually full responsibility for self-management. Now, there's around 1,100 under-18s living with moderate or severe haemophilia in the UK who are or will be transitioning from paediatric to adult care at some point. And to my knowledge, there are currently no formal initiatives or programs in place to enhance young people's capacity for self-manage, of which 7 key skills are shown on screen, or interventions focused specifically on encouraging adherence. Neither are there any up-to-date consultations to help determine the type of support young people living with haemophilia want emerging into adulthood. And what's more, I fear there is an ever-increasing knowledge gap around the basic science and awareness of treatments available today or in the pipeline, not least due to the absence of structured educational experiences that complement neo-millennial learning styles and preferences. Instead, this knowledge base is often acquired through an ad hoc process of learning by doing, which typically begins in early childhood. And I would ask, could this absence of formalised education potentially disadvantage young people's ability to self-manage and self-advocate effectively? Typically, young people should achieve complete independence from their caregivers with their own care by the age of 18. Yet it's already been shown that it can take more than 10 years for some young people to move from first practicing to self-infuse to conceptualising the totality of self-care, not until they're nearly 23. What's happening over this time that may set a precedent for their future health needs? Furthermore, the tendency to discontinue prophylaxis has also been observed during this life stage, presenting a significant risk of major bleeds, shown to be nearly a fifth in England and Wales. The risks may be attributed to many other causes, not least a lack of social support, a lack of engagement with the clinical team, as well as inadequate understanding about the severity and complexity of the condition. And what outside influences could be impacting on young people's ability to make ethically sound decisions with their treatment and self-care? Now, where physical restrictions and/or visible differences exist, or where red lines are being imposed by, say, healthcare professionals that set limitations rather than inspire the fulfillment of individual life aspirations, it is not unreasonable that young people, in the pursuit of belonging and with the increased vulnerability for social acceptance, will make risky decisions that can have irreversible consequences on their health. Reinforcing this self-doubt and low self-esteem is the conscious and subconscious comparison to the best and most enviable moments of their friends' lives being shared on social media. A lot can be changing for the young person between infrequent clinic appointments that could require a different dialogue and adjustment with treatment and self-care planning, complicated by a health service that's not necessarily designed for them. So we do have a number of practical tools at our disposal that go some way towards trying to improve the personalised experience. And I think these can be as empowering for us living with the condition as much as they are clinically meaningful for healthcare professionals and policymakers. But there's good indication that information interventions alone aren't sufficient in supporting treatment and broad self-management education, particularly across the paediatric years. And I think without the element of buy-in to your condition and being supported to recognise the fundamental need to be engaged in your clinical care, especially with the prospect of new improved treatments, this resource, whether it's, say, a booklet, a web-based intervention or supportive technology, can be ignored or overlooked. So I appreciate there's quite a lot of text on screen, but these are some top-line results from a qualitative study which considers social media use as a way to promote and facilitate the development of peer-to-peer disease management skills. A group of 10 to 17-year-olds living with severe haemophilia in the UK indicated their desire to meet others like them, to share experiences and reduce the feeling of isolation. The study suggested that adolescents may have limited or infrequent contact with their peers and often see each other only when they attend the haemophilia clinic, which might only be once or twice a year. And I think this is a really telling observation. The treatment centre and clinical team are not only the first point of contact about your own haemophilia, but the gateway to the wider haemophilia community and holistic support and services. What are we doing to maximise the opportunity to engage with these young people on every occasion they walk through the clinic door? How many missed opportunities are there to grab their attention? Now, the effects of a health education intervention targeting young people's attitudes and behaviours is going to greatly depend on who is delivering the education and how. We know young people tend to seek guidance and associate more closely with their educators who are on the same wavelength and whose opinions are of more influence. So it's natural that young people will highly value support from peers with the same chronic condition as themselves and perceive that peer educators with their condition can really empathise with their situation. Previous studies have adopted a peer leader approach in implementing programs addressing a variety of health issues in young people, such as diabetes, asthma, and sexual health, achieving positive health benefits. The methods apply vary considerably, and with no standardised outcomes, it does make it uncertain to know what component makes the most difference. Nonetheless, in a systematic review summarising the evidence base of over 1,000 studies using peer support, face-to-face groups run by trained peers which focus on emotional support, sharing experiences, education, and specific activities like social engagement, run regularly over a period of time, has been found to work well. One initiative I'm personally inspired by is MS Sessions. Now, this is a 3-day festival bringing together young people with multiple sclerosis from across Europe. Similar to haemophilia, educational, psychological and peer support needs are all thought to be important factors in aiding with the adjustment of living with MS and promoting a sense of self-empowerment to maintain a good quality of life in the face of adversity. The inaugural event attracted 116 young people with the lineup format influenced by TED Talks, covering everything from neurology to sexual health and employment. Now, whilst this isn't an intervention per se, importantly, it was organised and delivered by young people living with MS for young people living with MS, with peer leaders at the heart of the agenda. I think it's worth noting, from participant feedback that unsurprisingly meeting other MSers was the most favourite part of the whole event, and the sessions that resonated most were those that focused on their welfare. And actually, it was so successful they're running their second instalment in Bucharest in a couple of weeks' time. I appreciate I'm going at a really fast pace, so this is my penultimate slide. I believe the biggest challenge to co-create and deliver a meaningful age and developmental appropriate peer-led initiative in haemophilia lies with young people's levels of disengagement in the community. I would argue that, as MS is typically diagnosed in young adults, with most already having life experience behind them, the diagnosis can throw the individual into a process of grief and then self-activation, in whatever form this takes. Whereas young people living with haemophilia since birth may exist in a self-perceived normality, generally accepting the status quo of their condition, thereby not even considering looking or asking for help or support. And if they're not looking for it, how do we reach them? And what is the consistent value proposition to keep them engaged, to help convert from being a passive recipient of their care, just like Alistair said earlier, to playing an active role in their health? And I'm a huge music fan, so I thought a really good analogy of this is about music, building a music fan base. An audience listens and then walks away, whereas a fan base buys in for the long term, just like I have with my favourite band, the 1975. And this is achieved by making the fan or a young person living with haemophilia feel valued through content and products that are relevant and relatable, and creating a legacy in the individual through rewarding them so that they become a super fan, or should I say a super advocate for themselves and their peers. Final slide. Thank you, Alistair. I'm looking at the Baroness, I'm sweating. Yeah, no, joke, yeah. So, to finish off, so in my view, to truly have a social impact on young people's lives, we first need to redefine the engagement strategy in haemophilia at a national level. And this will require a shift in how we're delivering the key messages and alter young people's attitudes towards their condition. Now, it was mentioned earlier, and it's often said, don't let your disease define you, go live life to the full. And I wholeheartedly endorse the positivity, but I think we need to be mindful that this message may also send young people away. I think we need to add a caveat by promoting what a really exciting time it is to be in haemophilia and to embrace being a part of an awesome group of young people with a unique identity that is their bleeding disorder. And referring to my second bullet point, do young people identify with the brand of the patient groups like they may do with lifestyle brands that are permeating into every aspect of their daily lives? And I think this is what we have to aspire to. Build up regional activation at a grassroots level, overseen by a dedicated task force or team of specialists, set up through the commitment from all stakeholders, because everyone should have a vested interest to change young people's lives for the better. And only then do I feel young people will connect with what we're trying to do and value their own participation in shaping a peer-led experience made for them, by them. Thank you. Thanks, Alistair.